Recently, Charlie Rose interviewed Henry Kissinger about his experiences in Germany before and after the war. I've never been a fan of Kissinger, but his description of being an American soldier in Europe immediately after the war so matched my experiences of that same period that I thought the audio portion of the Rose program may interest you, and if not you, then maybe one or two of my immediate family that are knowledgeable of my past. That's the beauty of YouTube. You don't have to have the whole world be interested. I'm lucky to connect with one or two. If you're at all interested in what I did in Europe right after the war, go to YouTube and search Memories of Linz in 1947. That's Linz. I modified the tone of the audio in the Charlie Rose interview so you can more fully understand Kissinger's speech. I have only included the last third of the Rose interview, which is about the part of Kissinger history that I'm interested in. I can't find any flaw or bias in this interview. I think age has cut into Kissinger's appreciation of what happened in Europe after the war, as has mine.
Power in one of the small towns that you were given control of.
Then, at the end of the war, when the war was over, the task of the counterintelligence people was to denazify, that is, to get the people who had held any rank above a certain rank of Kreisleiter was that could not hold any governmental office. And if they had a higher rank, they were interned. And it was one of the jobs of counterintelligence to collect it. And also, in the very first phase, to restore public services until military government could come in. And considering that I was barely 21, that gave me an enormous amount of responsibility.
You have said, quote, I had absolute authority to arrest people. In the CIC, we had more power than even the military government.
Well, but it's a question of timing. We came in with the combat units.
Yeah.
The military government came in after the combat units. So while the combat units were there, we were moving and we were taking towns in which we didn't know who was who. And right at the end of the war, the Germans had ordered, or Hitler had ordered, to create guerrilla units. And then there were displaced persons and refugees, and in one situation, concentration camp. So that was our principal responsibility to bring about an order for the military, that the combat unit could exist there. And as soon as the combat unit went on to other things, then military came in.
Here's a letter you wrote as a young man. Speaking of Holocaust survivors, concentration camps were not only mills of death, they were also testing grounds. Here men persisted, in a sense, fought for survival, with the stake always nothing less than one's life, with the slightest slip a fatal error. Such was the filth, the compulsion, the debasement, that a person had to be possessed of extraordinary powers, both psychic and of will, to even want to survive. The intellectuals, the idealists, the men of high morals had no chance. Having once made up one's mind to survive, it was a necessity to follow through with a singleness of purpose inconceivable to you sheltered people in the States. Such singleness of purpose broached no stopping in front of accepted sets of values. It had to disregard ordinary standards of mortality. One could only survive through lies, tricks, and by somehow acquiring food to fill one's belly. The weak and the old had no chance.
That's how it looked to me, and that's how it was.
Can you take me back to when you were there and what you and what it was like?
You know, I haven't made it a habit ever to talk about these things. And for people in this audience, they'll know what a shattering experience it was, knowing that many people I knew had gone through a comparable experience in the camps, because it was not an untypical, it was a typical camp. And those prisoners they had trapped an SS man, and they were trying to hurt him, and they were too weak.
Too weak.
And it was simply the reduction of human beings to a level of degradation that was had been inconceivable.
You obviously chosen not to speak for it. I speak now because if ever to talk about it, this is the place to talk about it. Having said that, how do you think it has influenced you?
Well, it showed what can happen to a country if its most bestial elements are given free rein, and what can happen through segregating people, declaring them subhuman, and the consistency with which this was carried out. We captured the man who was in charge of that camp because he stayed there, and he turned it over to us because he thought he'd now get his orders from somebody else. To him, that camp was a normal part of existence.
What happened to him?
I don't know what happened to him. He went probably to woods. But you see, we moved on. This is where the distinction. But in the Bergen camp, which was the camp that was responsible for the whole region, that man, the commander of that, stayed behind, and he was hanged 6 months later. He was one of the first war criminals that was tried.
You stayed, being in counterintelligence, for 2 years after the war ended.
Well, I stayed, yes.
2 years.
Well, the war ended in July '45, and I stayed about 9 months in the area which then was assigned to me.
Could you have gone home then, or did you elect to?
I could have gone home maybe 10 months earlier than I did. But Kramer, whom you mentioned before, there was a European Command Intelligence School in Obamagao, and I got a civilian job as an instructor at the intelligence school for about 8 months. So altogether I stayed about a year longer.
Looking at everything that we have talked about this evening so far, tell me what impact, how it has influenced, do you think? A man who went on to, go to Harvard, become a distinguished professor, write lots of books about nuclear policy, about foreign policy, about diplomacy, about countries, and have developed strategies, ideas about how the world works. What was the influence of this experience we have talked about?
Well, there are two aspects to this experience. One is the experience of evil, of disorder, of the breakdown of civilized discourse, and of the vulnerability of societies when that framework collapses. And then, of course, at the end of the war, one saw this immense suffering that you've described, or that you've asked me to describe. But at the same time, there emerged the imperative of how are you going to rebuild this? And what are we going to do in order to prevent this from happening again? And how can you create an international system, and within Germany a national system, by which these tragedies could be avoided? So at first my duties and then my interests moved from understanding the nature of disorder, crisis, suffering, to how you can restore this and prevent it from happening again. And then it wasn't just my experiences. I started reading a lot. And so many of the things I've written may have had their impetus in this period, but the content of it I derived from other experiences as well.
What was the big mistake after World War I that the world had to learn the lesson and not make after World War II?
Well, first of all, World War I was a horrible mistake in the sense that these were nations that had been living together in a reasonably orderly manner, going into a war that they thought would last 6 months, and then turning it into a mass slaughter so that the civilized structure of many societies was torn up, and casualties were so enormous that faith in government as such was destroyed. Then after the war, the leaders who made the peace did not ask themselves the question of how the peace they were creating could be maintained. So they created a Germany, a settlement with Germany, which was too severe to be accepted, but too little aware of history, so that actually Germany's strategic position improved as a result of World War I. Before World War I, Germany was surrounded by big countries. After World War I, it was surrounded by a bunch of little countries, each of which were too weak to resist Germany by itself. And so the basis was created from which Hitler could, once Germany rearmed, Germany was in a strategically better position. But the statesmen of the world had not understood the lesson that you must have a concept of the objective of your policy, and not be swept away by the mood of a moment. And so when Hitler came into power, there was no framework within which they knew how to resist him. And he would make demands that at first seemed reasonable. And within an amazingly short time, within 5 years, got into a position from which he could threaten all of the European countries. So the lesson to be learned is to understand what circumstances can become so irrevocable that you have to resist them at the beginning of their occurrence and not wait until they turn into a full-fledged crisis.
Who failed to recognize that?
Who failed to recognize it?
Everybody.
Basically,
except the German resistance.
Basically, many Germans didn't recognize the full extent of what was going on. And in the surrounding countries, the World War I had taken such a toll that the reluctance to face another showdown was overwhelming. And so, in a series, it would have been very easy to resist Hitler. Say 1936, when the first move he made was, at the end of World War I, the territory beyond the Rhine in Germany was demilitarized. So the first move he did was to remilitarize that. Well, that sounds not unreasonable that you put military units in your own country. And so every year he kept escalating his demands. And the leaders were not looking, there were a few like Churchill who did see the consequences. But that was the basic dispute that was going on, whether Hitler could be brought to reason by making concessions, or whether one was dealing with a phenomenon that was so aggressive and evil that it had to be resisted immediately. That was the dispute between Churchill and Chamberlain.
And Churchill was in the wilderness.
Churchill was
called back to power.
But Churchill was out of power, and he kept making warning speeches, and he had the reputation of being a kind of troublemaker and ambitious.
Could another man have done what Hitler did, or did Hitler have some combination of evil and...
Well, Hitler certainly had some maniacal qualities. I mean, he had, if you look at, the other day there was some kind of a news program that showed his rise to power and where he entered a room to make a speech, and the gestures he made to attract attention himself. So he had a unique capacity of concentrated evil, and apparently a very spellbinding effect on people around him. I've asked German generals, what were you thinking? And they said, well, he'd look at you and you lost your judgment. So that was a special quality. But a readjustment of the European situation had to take place because there were as many people under foreign rule under the Versailles settlement as there had been before. That people, Czechs living